Hello everyone, my name is Reena Ramdev and I teach English Literature at the University of Delhi. I'd like to thank Professor Asun for inviting me to the Eurasia Spring 2021 course. Speaking to you like this is certainly not the best mode of communication, and I regret not being able to interact with you all as I could have with an in-person talk. But our times are such that distances are now only virtually being travelled. My talk today is on the graphic novel Bhimayan that came out in 2012. It narrates the life of Dr. B.R. Ambedkar and his fight against untouchability and caste violence. While looking at the artwork of the artists, the Vyams, who are Adivasis belonging to the Pradhan Gond community, I will try highlight the close interconnectedness and relationship that the Adivasi aesthetic, the rituals and the Adivasi aesthetic ritualizes and maintains in its art and its storytelling. While the moment of the Anthropocene, registering the human species and its impact as a geophysical force, accounts for the disasters of climate change and the fragility of ecosystems jeopardized by human consumption and domination, in the cultures of the Adivasi, perhaps there is on offer ways of understanding through their stories and their art a time when there was a difference between the human species being a biological agent and now becoming a geological agent in the Anthropocene. I'd like to start my presentation with The Song of Niyamgiri, which is a short stop-motion film made by Circa Films in 2014. This film draws attention very poignantly to the voice that lies unheard within the developmentalist model of the neoliberal state. The bauxite-capped Niyamgiri Hills in the eastern state of Odisha is home to the Dongria Gond tribe that has been battling for decades the forced acquisition of land and forests by mining corporations.
Sola kuba dayo kanjaki doru wahi evendudio. Ahana ina oprepo oro dehke yo. Ahana ina dramora zamana maniago. Oprepo rote kapeno mani sobo hati kini ago. Randi kum ada randi munraga ita mania. Ahaba avo kunda prakaya choka di magi. Ahaba avo munra prakaya choka di madu. Ni daging ade ya choka manu ini ago. Hatoging ako ya chora manu ko ini adu. Anetaga tadeke ka ya hababo de madu. Ahaba abo ambari wapungi herigo. Ahaba abo loko panka mantadigo. Waga matedi anaknya behili adinya go. Babo hanju dire yo jaga. Arde babo vayale eri ini go. Biri Amerika vayare eri go hati haju ho. Ene pakata hati ga haji mani go. Ahana ina iwadi ibabu wadu dige. Darmora zako hati ki ko manjane yo. Ene pagato ya hade de lo venagade. Yene tagata de bagi de mayo. Ahaba abo solo ko haji mani digo. Da nanu ore ko wandigo. Babo mandi puru ape nino bala punje kede inidigo. Solo ko tai haji maneri behmajo. Ahaba abo daye punja doru hile dodi. Ahaba abo lihi wahani go. Tamata tanya madam doni kineri do. Rai bi ita jada bita ondigo. Ene paga tate babo hari bodo de nai.
Adivasi translates as original inhabitants, and these are groups of indigenous people living across different parts of India. They are racially and culturally diverse and linguistically belong to 4 language families. The colonial government's attempt to take over forested areas resulted in violent clashes with the Adivasis, who were unable to furnish legal documented claims over their land. Since these were large forested lands yielding precious timber for the British Navy, the recalcitrant, unyielding Adivasis were opportunely notified by colonial cunning as criminal tribes under the 1871 Criminal Tribes Act. The Gonds are a tribal community from central India, and Bhimain's graphic artists, the Vyams, Durgabai and Subhash, belong to the Pardhan Gond subset of bardic priests and genealogists. In the 1980s, they grouped together with the principal aim of translating the community's ritual practices and performances into visual narrative art. The Vyams were approached by S. Anand and his Navyana publishing team for a commissioned graphic telling of Bhimrao Ambedkar's Waiting for a Visa in the year 2008. Titled Bhimain, it has been read as a counter-epic in relation to the revered Brahminical epic, the Ramayana. Prajna Desai talks about how the title of the Bhimain could be a cheeky send-up on the Ramayana, which is a pivotal Hindu text that recounts the high-caste mythical god prince Ram's exile from everyday royal luxuries. Bhimain's account of everyday expulsions from ordinary civic dignities like water, shelter and travel present an alternative epic of heroism. Interestingly, lacking as they were in formal school literacy, The Vyams had been unaware of the historical significance of Ambedkar and his fight against untouchability and caste violence. But soon after narrations over the storyboard with the publisher were done, they were, as Anand says, quote, making Ambedkar's story their own. The humiliations Ambedkar faced affected them deeply. They were moved and angered. They internalized the stories. The afterword to the Bhimine also draws attention to the struggle for equality that Gond Adivasi artists have faced in recent times. Durgabai, on her arrival at Navyana's office in New Delhi, had been stopped from entering the building as the landlady could not believe that the Vyams were commissioned artists, and she dismissively barred their entry, calling them yokels. Durgabai states in the afterword, both visually and narratively, how the incident of derision and abuse had been deeply hurtful, and this had brought into sharp recall for them the many instances of humiliation and abuse that Ambedkar had endured because of his caste. It is important to mention here that the violence of discriminatory practices that caste engenders is of a different order, as instances shown in the Bhimine illustrate. As a young schoolboy, Ambedkar is refused drinking water from the common drinking area in school, and this, along with several other episodes like his inability to find accommodation owing to his caste, are reminders of the ineradicability of caste that class is unable to counter. The Vyams had had no previous exposure to the graphic novel's art or the aesthetics of Western sequential bracketing, which they saw for the very first time in the work of Art Spiegelman, Joe Sacco, and Mariana Satrapi, and others through the books that were brought to them by the publisher. In the Bhimine, the Vyams maintain the Pardhan Gond pictographic tradition, using the fine intricacies of linear limning and teeming stipple work, incorporating grass, mustard, and grain patterns in their work. Unfamiliar and unused to canvas and paper as media, Gond artistry borrows from the motifs and patterns that adorn their walls and floors as murals. The unpaneled spread is created using the geometries of the Digna, widely seen in their wall art, which is the Bhitti Chitra, Bhitti meaning wall and Chitra meaning picture, which is painted with locally sourced organic colors like charcoal, limestone, and flower dyes. This and the drawings rich in intricate pastoral imagery keep intact the indigenous aesthetic that the Vyams sought to maintain. The anthropomorphized figures are common to the pantheistic mythology, and these find a resonant visuality in their narrative art. In the 1980s, J. Swaminathan had been tasked with setting up a museum of fine arts, and he was responsible both for the discovery of the famous artist Jangar Singh and for bringing Gond art to Indian and international art publics. Krishan Khanna, quoted in Roma Chatterjee's recent book, Speaking with Pictures, acknowledges Swaminathan's recognition of the numinous image at a time when most artists were dealing with phenomena. He emphatically stated again and again that the obsession with the phenomenal world was Western, and no matter how elegant or competent and efficient its art, it was too self-evident and immersed in the practical day-to-day. By the very nature of its concerns, it failed to gain access to the regions of mystery which were so central to art. The discovery and promotion of Gond art took place at a time when, according to Chatterjee, the need for an alternative genealogy for modernist abstraction was being felt, kindling an interest in marginal cultures and their so-called primitive arts. Swaminathan spoke of the Adivasi artist's ability to forge a parallel reality, creating what he cites as an inward growing meditative space where the pictorial forms become symbols of the human psyche. The graphics, as they come to be in the pages of the Bhimine, are there in scattered arrangements that stretch and create elastic frames. The pages invite a synoptic viewing, and the artistic detailing is fantastically imagined, shunning the demands of realistic representation. Nandini Chandra sees the scattered body parts as a telling comment on the Hindu moral economy that is hierarchized on the basis of anatomical splitting: heads, shoulders, hands, torso, and feet. The disparate body parts that are shown swimming in non-symmetrical frames symbolically smash the Brahminical hierarchy of caste ordering. The 3 types of speech bubbles used in the text are morphed animals or their parts. Those in the shape of a bird stand for victims and people who speak softly. The scorpion's tail represents the venom of those who subscribe to the caste system, and the thought bubbles with 3 thoughtful eyes represent words that cannot be heard but only perceived, and are used mostly to draw attention to the caste humiliation that Ambedkar experiences. G.N. Devi, the renowned Indian thinker and cultural activist, gave up academic life in the mid-90s to work with the Adivasis, setting up the Adivasi Academy in Gujarat to study and document Adivasi communities in India. Working closely with the community, he sees the Adivasi imaginary rooted within archives of racial and sensory memory rather than being based on a cultivated imagination. He says it's difficult to understand within the commonly accepted Western notion of ownership or property the Adivasis' relationship to land, forest, animals, and water, as it is rooted in a very different conceptual framework. They have associations with nature that explain how the natural world offers an insight into the maintenance of being. Belief in both interconnectedness and interdependence has been part of the wisdom of these people for centuries, transmitted orally across generations. Navjot Altaf Mohammadi, whose work is on the anthropogenic environmental degradation of the planet and the culture of unsustainability resulting from it, says of the experience of working in the tribal belt of Chhattisgarh that Adivasi culture, symbols, and ritualistic practices have emerged over centuries as part of their belief in the integration and nurturing of all living beings and the cyclical process of nature. According to the Adivasi, if humans do not cooperate and respect the environment and their relationship with the soil, their existence will be in danger. I see this as a process of communication and listening, being mobile with the possibilities of exposing oneself and exploring all the way around a continual self-transformation. This arrives at that fateful moment defined by the German sociologist Ulrich Beck as, quote-unquote, the anticipation of catastrophe. When anthropogenic forces reach a tipping point at which this slow and apparently timeless backdrop for human actions transforms itself with a speed that can only spell disaster for human beings. G.N. Devi draws attention to how in contemporary practice tribal Adivasi memories are being greatly undermined. He says that there is a general insistence that tribal children attend schools where non-tribal children do, and that they use medicines manufactured for others, that they adopt common agricultural practices, all because the world has very little time to listen patiently to the tribals, with their immense knowledge and creativity. We have decided, he says, that what is good for us is good enough for them. In the process, we are destroying a rich vein of our cultural heritage. A proper understanding of the tribal imagination can add to our literature and art. Indian literature has been burdened for the last 2 centuries by what is called the perspective imagination of Western origin. Because our systems of knowledge have been more or less replaced by Western systems, the Adivasi tribal is now the only Indian unaffected by colonial consciousness. To pose the question of memory once again may help us thus rekindle our culture, feels Devi. The tribal imagination is still to a large extent dreamlike and hallucinatory. It admits fusion between different planes of existence and levels of time in a natural and artless manner. In tribal stories, oceans can fly in the sky as birds, mountains swim in water as fish, animals speak as humans, and stars grow like plants. The spatial order and temporal sequencing do not restrict the narrative. This is not to say that tribal creations have no conventions or rules, but simply that they admit the principle of association between emotion and the narrative motive. Thus, stars, seas, mountains, trees, men and animals can be angry, sad or happy. In a 2018 study in Australia, rich visual parallels between indigenous artworks and microscopic natural structures hidden in the world revealed unexpected and intriguing similarities. The microscopic images, known as micrographs, were captured on transmission electron microscopes, which created enlarged projections of a thin sample slice and that revealed a flat top-drawn image similar to many of the artworks. Another similarity came from the natural forms and patterns found at the microscopic landscape, and cosmic scale. In indigenous cultures, stories shared and held in paintings record how the land and creatures were created, how they function together, and how people relate to them. For researchers, microscopic images reveal the tiniest structural details of the natural world. With experience and the knowledge passed down from previous generations, scientists read these stories and expand our understanding as they strive to answer the question, how and what makes the world function as it does. The art scholar Orogita Das says that Gond art is very similar to Aboriginal art because the Aborigines have their own stories like we do about creation, and they too make dashes and dots. Aboriginal art and Gond art have their connection because we are originally from the same continent of Gondwana when there were just two continents, Gondwana and Laurasia. India and Australia come from Gondwana and America comes from Laurasia. The performances, dance and rituals as well as the drink they serve is very much like ours. This synchronicity theory is supported by the Paris-based gallerist Hervé Perdroil. And he says, like the paintings of Jangar's Australian counterparts, the works of the Gonds feature dots of different colors. For the Aborigines, the dots refer to dreaming and territory. With regard to the Gonds, Jangar explained to me that when the shamans of his tribe go into a trance, they have the feeling that the particles of their bodies disperse into space to join with those of the spirits and form other bodies. This is an ancestral, poetic vision of the atom, of the infinitely small joining the infinitely large. As you can see on slide 9, there are intricate similarities between the pointillism of Adivasi indigenous art and the micrograph's swimming layers. The Anthropocene, as Bruno Latour, Dipesh Chakrabarti and others have in recent decades drawn attention to, is forcing us to apply what I see as the Walter Benjamin emergency brake. Of course, Walter Benjamin was referencing capitalism. Here, the moment of the Anthropocene is making us confront a past that we seek to disavow, but one that forces us to radically rethink human agency beyond the individual to that of the species, which is now operating as a geophysical force. As Chakrabarti says, we can become geological agents only historically and collectively, when we've reached numbers and invented technologies that are on a scale large enough to have an impact on the planet itself. And that is what the idea of the Anthropocene is. I mean, that's what gives birth to the idea of the Anthropocene. For the same reason, this also poses a challenge to storytelling, brought upon by what has been called a crisis of the imagination. As Alexa Wyke von Mosner, in her work on the Anthropocene, talks of how the telling of our times need a different kind of storying. For storytelling, in fact, serves evolutionary purposes, as she says. And given that over thousands of years humans have transformed their experiences, hopes and fears into stories, it seems worthwhile to look closely at some of the ways in which we currently tell each other stories about global environmental change and human agency in the Anthropocene. This is the pause that a developmentalist model needs to consciously make way for it to allow other imaginations and their stories to come forth. While in my presentation I have sought to draw attention to the indigenous aesthetics of Pardhan Gond art in the Bhimayan, highlighting also its imbrication within a system of interconnectedness with the natural living world, I'm also deeply aware of an easy romanticization that this must guard against. Within the Anthropocene debates, looking at the pointillism common to, say, the indigenous aesthetics as visualized in artwork across continents and under skin layers, would gesture at what I see as, what I've just spoken about, the moment of pause. For there are knowledge system pedagogies that would account for ways to sustain life and this planet in ways that we've probably willfully ignored and relegated up until now. Thank you.